I'll be hosting this, but before I start to do the introductions, I want to pass the microphone to my friend and colleague, Professor Jay Pearson.
Thank you, Professor Jentleson. I'm Jay Pearson. I'm a professor here at the Sanford School of Public Policy. I'm also the Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And I've been asked to read a statement on civil discourse and humane consideration to both provide some context for this evening's event and to set the tone for what we hope will be a vibrant but respectful discussion. In an increasingly diverse, dynamic, and interactive world, effective public policy decision-making must embrace open communication across social differences. Policymakers may disagree on specific issues, but we understand dismantling or disrupting opportunities for honest and sincere communication does not contribute to understanding the nature of those differences and disagreements or the move towards their resolution. We understand and acknowledge that this level of deep communication by its very nature is likely to be emotionally charged, and that conversations addressing identity distinctions by national origin, ethnicity, and religion can be particularly contentious. This is certainly the case for the violent conflict in Gaza that is impacting the Israeli and Palestinian people and their families, friends, as well as loved ones, including from other nations in the region and the world over. Places from where members of our Sanford community hail: students, staff, and faculty. Fortunately, we have tools and practices to help us through these difficult times. Humanizing consideration entails recognizing, acknowledging, and then taking steps to accommodate as well as alleviate human suffering. This includes an appreciation for the lived experiences of students, staff, and faculty, cast in historical and contemporary context, particularly those who share identities with the most directly impacted by current events and who may be struggling with internalized trauma. It also includes creating opportunities to hear representatives from multiple perspectives, including across the range of Israeli and Palestinian voices. Additionally, well-crafted, cogent arguments by members of profoundly impacted communities are sometimes shared in impassioned ways. We should expect that, right? I happen to think that's okay, and we need to be big enough to get past that. Went off script, sorry. That passion does not justify dismissing the argument's merits, nor should it diminish commitment to engage dialogue, which requires that despite these challenges, or perhaps more importantly, because of them, faculty, staff, administrators at the Sanford School of Public Policy and in the broader Duke community should hold as a core value taught in our courses, advanced in our research, and modeled through our actions, the essential role of civil discourse, humane consideration, and respectful dialogue, all towards the end of securing effective policy resolution across social differences. Our speakers have perspectives informed by their unique lived experiences. Likewise, students bring perspectives informed by their own unique lived experience. And in the spirit of engaged dialogue, we welcome and encourage student questions for this evening's event and beyond. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Pearson, and both the words and the spirit of your comments, I think, are much appreciated and much valued. If I could just add a couple of comments to what my colleague has said. Really, one is a clarification, the other is an affirmation, and the other is a recognition. Clarification is that we'd invited Dr. Scheindlin here actually last June to discuss Israel's democracy crisis with her book that she'd published, The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel. That was the original title. We nailed down a date. It worked for her, for American Grad Strategy, and for Duke, missed other events, and that was October 25th. With the Israel-Hamas war that started October 7th, we expanded the scope and the title, including the ways the two are related. We did not transform the event into a broader panel of other speakers for two main reasons. One was we felt that this panel would have value in its own right. I think as Professor Pearson was introducing, as you'll see, Dr. Scheindlin is not here as a spokesperson for the Israeli government. Indeed, has been and continues to be a critic in certain respects. And there's a lot of value in engaging with folks who are less sort of just my side is right, yours is wrong, than I am who I am, my country is my country, but I speak to not to its flaws, not just its strengths, and my goal can be one shared with you. Second reason is that, and I will say, by the way, from my own experience, when I've been in government, involved in some of these negotiations in the Middle East with Israelis and Palestinians, with Israelis and representatives from other Arab states, this has actually been the way we tended to make some progress in an effort for people to sort of see that they didn't have to necessarily take their own view only, but to try to find some common ground. The other reason that we went ahead with is that this should not be Duke's only event on these issues. ATS is one programmer. There are others, and myself and my colleagues really stand ready to engage with others in comparable events. The affirmation, I think, is, again, consistent with what Professor Pearson said. This is what we do as universities. We should, can, and need to engage with tough topics at tough times. And I can say this, and you can't, nor can Professor Peter, but I was a student way back in the Vietnam War era days, right? You know, got a few years, guys. And I remember then the value that teach-ins and other opportunities had to learn from our faculty who had some experience and expertise in these areas. And I'm not here to tell you we did everything right back in the anti-war movement, far from it. But I think one of the values that we had was those opportunities that we very much want as faculty to do for our students what my professors and others did for us. And the last point is recognition. Again, we said all that, I recognize that this is not just another policy issue. My sense is for most, if not everyone in this room, it's also personal. No doubt in many different ways and with some differences in sadness and anger and outrage. But more than many policy issues, this is deeply and widely personal. So in that context, we're going to try to have a valuable dialogue here. We will open to questions, and we'll go through the procedures for the questions when we get to that point. I will say one more thing before I introduce Dr. Scheindlin, is that the American Grant Strategy Program has a number of events upcoming. I'll just mention one or two that are upcoming on Tuesday, November 7th. It has Major General William J. Walker, the former Sergeant at Arms of the U.S. House of Representatives, to speak with us, who was Sergeant at Arms on January 6, 2021, which is followed on November 15th by a session with the Secretary of the Army, Christine Wormuth, and the like. And there are others that I encourage you to go to the AGS website for. So with that, let me introduce you to our guest. Dahlia Scheindlin is a fellow at Century International. She holds a PhD in political science from Tel Aviv University. She's advised and conducted research not only in Israel over 20 years, but indeed has been involved with civil society elections and referendum in 15 different countries, in Albania, in Bulgaria, in Egypt, in Greece, in Hungary, in Kosovo, Ukraine, the United States, and Zanzibar among them. So she brings an interesting perspective to us on these broader issues. She's done a lot of work on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and conducts some of the ongoing joint Israeli-Palestinian public opinion survey research, collaborating with the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research. She's a founding member of Plus 972 magazine. She writes frequently for Haaretz, one of the leading Israeli newspapers, and for many other publications, and frequently appeared on CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, and others. Spoke yesterday at Columbia. After she's with us, she'll be headed to some universities in Washington. Tony, please join me in welcoming Dr. Dahlia. Now that I've said what I have in your bio and a little bit, I know from our experience working together, I want to pass you the microphone and tell people a little bit more about the work you do and how it relates to and frames much of what we're going to talk about tonight.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for this invitation, and thank you everybody for being willing to listen to more commentary about this issue. I will also start by saying, if any of you are feeling emotional, I can probably beat you. It's a very difficult time to be able to speak analytically and keep it together, because I don't need to explain, the events in the region are so vicious and violent that I think we're all trying to get our footing. And we were all surprised. A little bit about my work over the years that relate to the issue. So I think, first I should say that I'm originally from the US, but I moved to Israel in 1997. And by 1999, I began working on political campaigns. I began working on a political campaign for a party and a leader who were running on the ticket, on the platform of reviving the peace process that had been slow. It wasn't exactly dead, but these were the Oslo years, the years which now we look back on with a very, very different understanding of what that peace process was. But at the time, and I am old enough to remember when Oslo was signed, I was an undergrad, it was not only considered, it was the only significant bilateral breakthrough that had ever happened. And many of us at the time thought it was going to be the gateway towards reaching a final status peace resolution. Now we call it a final status resolution, but then we actually used to speak of a peace treaty being signed. And for me, the idea that I would fall accidentally onto a political campaign to put somebody in power who was running on the platform of reviving the peace process was like hitting the jackpot. I thought my dream had come true. I could be part of advancing peace in the region. It was one of the reasons I moved to the region. I was involved in peace and dialogue efforts with Israelis and Palestinians, or Jewish students and Palestinians already as an undergrad, and continued to do that kind of work. I thought I would do that kind of work when I moved to the region, and I considered it a lucky break to work for the candidate who eventually won the election and did try to revive the peace process. The process failed. You know, the region descended into violence, very severe violence that recalls to some extent what we're doing now. And I continued to work as a professional on political campaigns, but very quickly I sort of gravitated towards the civil society community, what we used to call the peace community. And first as a volunteer, because I was always activist in various peace organizations. And then eventually when they realized that I had the skill of public opinion research as a basis for strategy building, they began to come to me to ask how could they connect with the Israeli public and try to get the Israeli public to recommit to a peace process while the Second Intifada was going on. And the Second Intifada involved both a series of suicide bombings against Israeli civilians and Israel reoccupying Palestinian towns. For those years, it's almost comparable to now. There was zero hope in a way. And yet the memory of a peace process was not that long ago. And so the peace organizations were coming to me to say, let's understand the Israeli public more deeply. Let's do survey research, focus groups, talk to people, try to figure out what we would have to say to get Israelis to recommit to supporting a peace process. And eventually I became involved with Palestinians doing similar work, and then eventually became involved in the Israeli-Palestinian survey research projects over the years. So that is one of the major backbones of what I do. I would say over time, the peace camp, what we used to call all of those organizations in civil society who were advancing Israeli-Palestinian peace, I think they got overtaken by the human rights organizations, by organizations of Israelis who were working within the Israeli system to try to advance the cause of Palestinians whose rights were being violated by the occupation. And why do I say they kind of superseded the peace camp? Because the idea of peace lost traction and lost funding and lost capacity. But the human rights organizations sort of came in their place. And they also needed the kind of work that I was able to provide because they came under a very vicious attack from Israeli society. And this transition happened, I would say, around the time of 2009, 10. What happened in 2009, late 2008, 9? Two things. First, the first Gaza war, CAS-led. I would call it the Gaza war. It's a war between Israel and Hamas. And Netanyahu comes back to power. And so at that time, we see an unprecedented attack from Israeli society, and I should say it included politicians and media commentators from the right wing against human rights organizations, and I became the person who was supposed to fix it, which I couldn't do. But that became another big part of what I do. Along the way, I decided that I wanted to understand these issues in much greater depth than you can do as a consultant working on campaigns, because campaigns are, kind of slash and burn. Everything's very fast. You collect an amazing amount of data, but you don't really have time to analyze it in depth. So I went back to do a PhD, and I decided to work in my academic work on other conflicts that were not Israel-Palestine. That was partly by accident, but also because I worked in many of these other places. And so I worked on Kosovo, I worked on Nagorno-Karabakh, and I worked on Northern Cyprus. And that grew out of my work in some of those places and deepened my realization that there is a lot we can learn from comparing these kinds of conflicts. Some things we can learn, some things are comparable, some things are contrast. But I became a big kind of missionary for putting any one conflict into the perspective of what we share with other societies around the world, And I bring that back to my work as a practitioner. And then I also realized I felt the need to communicate these things much more broadly than you could by whispering into the ears of politicians, right? Over the years, I started to feel frustrated that, I give my heart and soul to politicians and they mess it all up. And began writing in my own voice. First, I started a column on public opinion with the Jerusalem Report, and then colleagues of mine, friends of mine got together and decided that what we saw as the mainstream Israeli media, we did not think was sufficiently critical of many of the mainstream narratives in Israeli life. And we began 972 magazine, which was an online publication, as a way of saying we want to be freed of what we see as the editorial constraints in most Israeli media, including the left-wing Israeli media. Let's just be honest about which side of the map 972 is on. If anybody knows it, you know what I mean. And we developed, a group of Israeli and Palestinian writers from the region. That was our contribution. We were not foreigners. We were from the region, reporting on the region and providing commentary and analysis. And that became a way for me to express, I think, a lot of critical ideas that have been building up over the years, forge partnerships with people, and say everything that I had not been able to say for a long time. And then I migrated from there to the realization that it was also important to me to speak to the kinds of communities who don't agree with everything I think. And so I just diversified. In other words, I continue to do public opinion research and strategy for civil society organizations. I continue to work on political campaigns. I do some academic work. I write for more mainstream publications now. I write regularly at the Haaretz, which is mainstream, I would say, in the mainstream liberal left community. But I also work hard to try to get my ideas into, more centrist publications, let's put it that way, more establishment publications, because A, they do get a bigger audience than a niche publication, but also you have to learn how to speak in a way that you're actually, paying some respect to the fact that people may disagree with you, and that's legitimate, and that you have to be able to hear how they think of things and respond to their concerns in a genuine way, not in I hope not in a patronizing way. That's what I try to do over the course of
So thanks for that broader context. We'll come back to some of these issues. We'll zoom out to them in a second, but to focus in on the particular issues at hand. So Dahlia wrote an op-ed that some of you may have seen in the New York Times during the first week of the war, titled "The Pathways to Peace Are Getting Darker." And let me just read a couple excerpts on this, and then kind of ask you to give us a sense for where things are and how, like many Israelis right now, she writes, I'm inconsolable. The pain over lost lives and hostages accumulates. But this moment is excruciating for me for another reason. In those frantic first hours on Saturday as the events unfolded, I feared that they could spell the final failure of what I view as my life's work, a commitment to peace, justice, equality, and a reduction of political violence. It mentions Hamas's savage attack, and then goes on to say Israel has scoffed at international law for decades by expanding settlements, annexing territory conquered in war, and suffocating the civilian population in Gaza through a 16-year blockade with few repercussions. The hopeful note, I've seen the other side too. Solidarity that cuts across bitter political divides. My Palestinian and Israeli friends and colleagues comfort one another in times of escalation. We bond over our commitment to ending systems of oppression and injustice, and deplore violence against civilians. Can you kind of give a sense for, and I know how hard it was to write, you talked to me about how hard it was to write this at that moment. And I think, frankly, my own view, contrary to many, the op-eds that appeared, which were either this side's right, the other side's right. It was really an effort, I think, to assess it. But can you give us a sense for, why you think, again, at least some key factors, this war broke out now, what its dynamics are. We'll come back later to where it's going, but how you sort of see those aspects of where we've been, on and since October 7th.
On and since October 7th. I mean, I think the first point I want to make is just to zoom out a little bit. Why did this break out now? Because no conflict is ever frozen. A conflict is either resolved or it continues. And, for those of us who study unrecognized states, we have this idea that there are frozen conflicts. It's not a term usually applied to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but I think Israelis convinced themselves that the conflict was manageable. You probably all heard the term conflict management or shrinking the conflict. I think the people who advocated strategies of conflict management or shrinking the conflict have a lot to answer for right now. because conflicts will always eventually have the cycles of escalation and violence. So that's in the big picture. In the immediate picture right now, I think that we have to look into the internal dynamics of Hamas, how analytic we want to get about Hamas's decision making. Was it pragmatic and rational in their methodology, or was it, sheer nihilism? But why now? I mean, I do think we can go back to the postponement of Palestinian elections in April 2021, Hamas realizing that there was no real route towards an actual competition that might result in Hamas becoming the true leader of the Palestinians. And then also, dealing with the blockade for all those years, knowing that its position wasn't getting any better, although paradoxically, the Israeli government's policy had been to kind of allow Hamas to get somewhat stabilized and even stronger through the deal with Qatar. So you have on the one hand a situation where the Palestinian population of Gaza is more and more squeezed over the years, increasingly angry, desperate. People talk about feeling like they are dead while alive, no economic prospects, unemployment over in the mid 40% range, 60 to 60 something percent among youth. And so you have an increasingly angry population channeling their anger at Israel through an organization that is getting somewhat stronger, partly because Israeli policy allows it to get stronger through the Qatari deal. So that is the kind of Hamas perspective that leads to a situation where Hamas says we don't really have the possibility of political competition. We have lulled Israelis into thinking they're a pragmatic partner. We need to do something bigger to break the equation. That's, to indulge the pragmatic side of Hamas. I mean, from their perspective. And then they begin planning this, as far as we know, sometime between, sometime in 2022. The documents we have show that there were elaborate plans in place already by October 2022. And then you can add to that the fact that Israel itself moves into a phase of very severe internal crisis. A government is elected and comes into power that immediately undertakes plans that the majority of Israelis find so terrifying that it generates the biggest social protest in Israel's history. By some accounts I've heard of experts who study nonviolent protests, it's the longest, most enduring mass protest in pretty much any country. And that's because Israelis are really fearful that their government is about to abuse its power and completely change the constitutional order. And then you start to see the phenomenon of Israelis who say we are not going to show up for reserve duty. This is at a time when the West Bank was becoming more violent, partly because settlers were more empowered, rising settler violence, the proliferation of Palestinian militias that are falling out of the control of the PA. So we see the most violent 2 years preceding this crisis in the West Bank. Okay, and then in general, we see escalation, also possibility of escalation on the northern front, and the Israeli security establishment begins to warn that the social crisis, the anti-government protests, are leading Israelis to, withdraw from their commitment to serving in the army, which is weakening the army precisely at a time when there's escalation on these fronts. This probably contributed to Hamas accelerating the decision to do this kind of attack at some point, to take advantage of Israel being involved and consumed by this crisis. The government, by all accounts, not just by all accounts, and we've seen it all throughout the course of the year, has utterly neglected other governing priorities, having marshaled all of its resources to focus almost obsessively on dealing with or trying to advance its agenda to undermine the Israeli judiciary in the face of what was an unexpected level of protest. And one great example of that neglect is simply the fact that we had a spike in crime and homicides among the Palestinian citizens of Israel to the point where it was like 100% higher than the previous year, because our Minister of National Security is one of the key figures and one of the most extreme figures in the Israeli government, who was much more, consumed by trying to advance its policies and not dealing with his actual ministry. That's just one example of neglected priorities. The army was also heavily deployed in the West Bank, which contributed to the fact that it was unable to reach the southern residents in time while the attacks were going on. And that is partly in response to the escalations that we had seen in the West Bank over the course of those years. So, the long-term factors of an unresolved conflict, the short-term or the medium term of the 16-year, a very severe blockade on Gaza and the resulting pressures, combined with this policy of keeping Hamas just at the right level, according to Netanyahu's plan, and then the social and democratic crisis in Israel, which kind of lowered the defenses and lowered the attention to other governing priorities, including apparently security, I think led to the decision to do the attack roughly this time with, I would imagine, significant symbolism of conducting the attack close to Yom Kippur during October, 50 years on the 50-year anniversary of the October War. And then we can bring in the geopolitical factors. For example, the possibility that Hamas was also trying to assert the Palestinian cause and to prove to the other Arab communities, other Arab countries that had normalized with Israel, that they could not simply get around the Palestinian issue, and that Hamas was going to be the leader in putting the Palestinians back on the map.
There's so many aspects of this, and one of the others is obviously the ethical dimensions, right? That the attacks on October 7th, which were called terrorism, but it was really a massive military operation using terrorist tactics. It penetrated Israel's borders in 7 different spots, the largest killing of Jews since the Holocaust. And now what we're seeing in Gaza, the bombing affecting civilians, numbers vary, but clearly lots and thousands of people being killed, displaced, hospitals not functioning and the like. And I think not only for you or for me, but for everyone in this room, it's sort of trying to figure out where your ethical compass is, right? And, for some people, it goes right to saying, oh, I know where mine is. Israel is right, and Israel's aggrieved, and Hamas is wrong and evil, and maybe even sorry for those Palestinian Gazans, but the ends justify the means here. And then for some others, the compass people, goes in a direction where it's Hamas is justified, it's occupation, it's persecution, kind of a different form of ends justifying the means. But for those that are not comfortable with either one of those, trying to figure out where that ethical compass is, when one sees, deaths on all sides of civilians and stuff. And I'm not asking you for an answer to that, but maybe give people a sense of your own, wrestling with that issue, because I think all of us in this room, or many of us in this room, are trying to wrestle with that as well.
I mean, again, just to wax idealistic, I would have liked to be a pacifist in life. I would have liked for there not to be any war, but I think I realized early on that's not going to be the case. And like most people who, support the liberal post-war international rules-based order, we don't truly believe that war can be eradicated. We try to contain it. And I think, my ethical compass is, says, I can't judge every single case. The only thing we have to go on are some abstract principles of how to limit the damage to civilians in war, or base the behavior in war on the best. What we've managed to come up with is the best the human race can do so far is, to my mind, is the international post-war order, based on the principles that there's universal value to human rights, to human beings, and that all human beings deserve basic protections and human rights. Now, I know that there's a controversy over whether that is really, a hypocritical concept, whether it's, of course, it's, not equally applied across the board, but leaving aside all of the flaws and genuine hypocrisies, leaving it aside for now, because there are many situations in which I myself have written about the broader picture of historic, contradictions of how international law and the international rules-based order has been applied or not applied, which I think does incredible damage in the future. But for right now, my only compass is to say we have this basis to try to guide us for the rules of war. It either applies to everybody or it applies to nobody. And this is why I think there is a tremendous, sense of confusion, because I don't think it's avoidable. When I saw what happened on Saturday morning, there was, a horrifying sense of we are being attacked. And suddenly I became a tribal we, even though I've spent my entire life working with Palestinian partners, friends, colleagues, equals. Okay. But nevertheless, this was an attack on Israel. You can't avoid that reality. It's uncomfortable. And at the same time, Israel then, attacks Gaza. We can't just say Israel attacked Hamas, because as far as we know, possibly over 60% of the casualties have been civilians. Those are the best estimates that I can tell. We're talking over 1,000 children. And so you can't ignore that either if you are really to look at the situation with integrity, but as a person who lives in the region is experiencing it every day. And I have to think about all those things while I'm running to the shelter that I don't have in my apartment. okay, because there's been 4 to 5 salvos of rockets just over Tel Aviv many of the days since this started. You know, I don't know what to tell you, but all I have to say is that we have this basis to rest on. And I think that everybody does a disservice to the concept of, you know, making, again, the word progress sounds very naive these days and maybe, you know, has bad connotations, but whatever it is, we have this basis for trying to limit the damage of war if war has to happen, and it needs to be applied universally. That's all I can tell you in terms of guiding my thinking. The other point that I want to make, which may seem not entirely connected, but is to try as much as I can to verify all the information. I think we have a really, really deep problem that is making it very hard for everybody to make decisions about what to think, what to say, and what to do, because we don't know if the information is real, or worse than that, we assume it's real without verifying it. I mean, this is a little bit unfair, but a personal friend of mine sent me an op-ed to review today that this colleague and friend had written. And this is a person I admire deeply. And the person cited certain atrocities that had been committed in the South, or at least we have heard they've been committed in the South during Hamas's attack. And I said, you need to give a source for this, because some of these are under dispute and they may have happened. And I'm not disputing them, but until I see the documentation, we need to be careful about saying. And the person was like, wait, really? I mean, the point is, nobody's trying to make up information, but it's so easy to propagate things that are wrong. And those things that are wrong have enormous consequences for the kinds of reactions we all want to take. So I'm not going to get into what might be wrong or what might be right, but I will say the principle is to verify everything to the best extent possible before making a decision about it.
Yeah, I think that's great, especially in fast moving, where there's an incentive, whether it's the organized media or others, to get out there first, right? And that often, is more important than the other part. So, with what you said, let's zoom back out to some of the other work you're doing in other parts of the world. Students know that there's real value in, comparative public policy, comparative case studies. And when I was serving in the State Department in the Bill Clinton Al Gore administration in the early 90s, the paradox was that was when we were making great progress in the Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli-Jordanian issue. But then we also had, Rwanda and Bosnia and Somalia, right? So you've worked, in fact, Dahlia told me that she was actually in Armenia working on the issues there that have revolved around the latest in Nagorno-Karabakh when this was happening. So, no two cases are alike, but maybe one sense of what you see as patterns or lessons, or at least nuggets that you can draw from some of the other work you've done on conflicts that are in a fundamental way based on identity that might pertain to the current situation with Israel and the Palestinians and Hamas.
Yeah, I mean, just to do a little bit of, to give you a little bit of background, we talked about it before, but I have done, if anybody's interested in this approach of looking at other conflicts in order to understand deeper dimensions, or at least what we share in common and what we might learn from them, I've done a lot of work on this. I have a number of policy papers out about it. So I won't be able to get that deep now, but I will say, yes, I was in Armenia when this was happening because I had been following what was essentially an Azerbaijani assault on, this, you can call it an enclave, I guess, but it was a de facto autonomous Armenian populated region within the boundaries of Azerbaijan, but it had never actually been under Azerbaijani control since both Azerbaijan and Armenia became independent. And Azerbaijan swept in on September 19th, the day after the book was published, and essentially expelled, there's no other way to put it, about 120,000 Armenians who then fled to Armenia, who had been living there for centuries, if not millennia. And I came to cover the aftermath of it because I thought it was really a historic event that is not often given a lot of attention in Western media. The South Caucasus is kind of a faraway place. I thought it was, obviously some kind of, war crime or a violation of human rights. I mean, expelling a population is bad in its own right. But also I thought it is a real injury to what I wrote about, the international system. Because what you have is a long simmering conflict that could not be resolved by diplomacy. And there have been attempts over the years. Western sponsored, European sponsored negotiations, OSCE sponsored negotiations, the Minsk group, none of them worked. So there have been various rounds. And in the end, in 2016, there was a little escalation. And the negotiations still didn't really work. And then in 2020, there was a full-scale war for 6 weeks in which thousands of people were killed, and there still wasn't any real success of negotiations, even though there was kind of a ceasefire agreement. And finally, you have what was essentially a military resolution to the conflict. And I thought, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the end. I've got to go there and figure out what's going on and really look at this deeply, because I think this could be a sea change, especially because it comes on the heels of the worst violation we've had to the international system in a long time, which was Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so I went there and I was talking with people and talking to refugees. And one thing the Armenians kept saying was, why didn't the international system protect us? Why didn't the international community protect us from this? And it was very poignant because of the failure, but mostly because they believed it would. Okay, they believed it would. There had been a blockade on Nagorno-Karabakh that the Azerbaijanis had placed, just violating the ceasefire agreement from about mid-December. People had been without food, fuel, medicine. Sounds familiar if you're coming from the Middle East and you follow what's going on in Gaza for the last 16 years. I spoke to children who were refugees, in towns in Armenia who said, we would go to school, but I fainted twice in school, somebody told me, because I didn't have enough food. Their teachers couldn't show up to school for part of the time because they didn't have fuel to come in on buses. So first of all, we know the tactics can inspire other countries when you have tactics like this being used. Secondly, again, on the bigger level, I was struck by how the Armenians not only felt the failures of the international system, but still believed that it should have been there to help them. And thirdly, and I didn't say this to the Armenians I was interviewing, but I remember very well talking to Azerbaijanis over the years who said, wait a second, the Armenian side had been occupying additional territories for all of the time since the first war in the 1990s. There were 4 UN Security Council resolutions recognizing that Armenia was occupying our sovereign territory, and nobody was able to resolve that for us. Nobody was able, through this great international system, to protect our sovereign territory. So each side feels like it has these grievances. And that was, I think, the major thing is like the question of, is there anything left to this international system? And that applies in Israel-Palestine because of what I just said. Israel has been violating international law all these years. Now Hamas has committed a terrible war crime. And every time there's talk about, Palestinians have joined the ICC, Israel has not. But the real question is, if one side starts accusing the other, well, frankly, both sides have at least committed activities that are at risk of being war crimes. And so does any of it matter? Is this system able to deter or bring justice when those things happen? And those are common to all of these conflicts. So that's the major thing. I think the other major thing is what I said before. I will say it again. I will never say it enough. There's no such thing as a frozen conflict. For a long time, Nagorno-Karabakh was considered a frozen conflict. So I see this in every place I work on. We should keep our eyes on the Balkans too while we're at it. Okay. And I think the third thing I'll talk about, just to keep it sort of short, is, even though there are many points of comparison, is that there are lots of overlapping psychological dimensions. The self-perceptions of people who are involved in long-running conflicts really overlap. And the biggest one is the sense that we are the victim. We are the victim. We are the only victim. And if we are the victim, there can't be any other victim. And most of the time, it's accompanied by a sense that nobody pays attention to our victimhood. And so therefore, our side, whichever our side is, has to spend a lot of its resources convincing the world that they're the victim in an exclusive way. And I think that exclusivity of victimhood is one of the things we're seeing certainly in Israel and Palestine right now. And I think it's one of the things that prevents people from being able to reach across the divide, and share their experiences of being victims or understand where they have been the aggressors, even if they are also the victim.
Yeah, that's really very helpful. The Genocide Convention after World War II, one of the first acts of the United Nations in 1948, the motto was never again. But what we've seen around the world is yet again and again and again, as we've talked about the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar and many other cases. And there are always similarities, there are always unique aspects. There are definitely unique aspects to the situation in Israel and Palestine, but there are other dynamics that are similar and that one can try to learn from. So a couple more questions, and I'm going to open it up, questions from the audience. Let's come back to the situation at hand, and what's being referred to, what's next, the day after. First aspect of that is the question of what is Israel's next move? Is there a ground incursion? Is there an occupation? And I guess I'm asking you analytically to say what you think is most likely to happen. There's differences emerging in the United States and Israel on this right now. And maybe if you like, prescriptively what you think the best option would be at this point.
Great. This is a great audience because you'll help give me feedback on what my prescriptive idea. What I think will happen is difficult because, the government, I think, has been chaotic in its response, of course, because everybody was taken by surprise. And to any students who are with me this afternoon, you heard me say this already. The government, obviously, I think rushed to the idea that it was going to have a ground operation. We thought it was going to happen within days, which would have been unprecedented, rapid fire, so to speak. And since then, I think for a number of reasons, it's been delayed. We don't know the precise reason because we're not inside the head of the prime minister, but the number of reasons I can think of for why it's been delayed include American involvement. I think the Americans' first priority has been to try to prevent a regional escalation, and I think that they have been attempting to hold back Israel from going for immediate ground incursion, as part of trying to prevent the regional escalation, I imagine. I think that's part of it, in addition to sending this, very heavy show of force to the region. The hostages have something to do with it, right? The Israeli government is coming under significant fire from the families of the hostages for, again, chaotic management, PR exploitation of the hostage situation. But to the extent that there is some sort of negotiation going on, and there are various channels of negotiation. There's the Qatari channel, there's the channel with Egypt, there's the Americans who are involved. Everybody's keeping a very tight lid on, who's talking or who's not talking, but we're hearing different things about what the potential is. We've seen 4 hostages released so far. So I think that at first there was a very zero-sum game in what we knew about those negotiations. Hamas was saying, stop the bombing, and we would consider releasing hostages. Israel said, not only we're not going to stop the bombing, we won't even talk about a ceasefire. And they asked the Americans not to talk about the ceasefire, and the Americans, apparently in State Department, asked their people not to even use the word ceasefire. So it was never on the table for Israel. It was the only major demand for the Palestinians, for Hamas, and it was a complete no-go. So as far as we knew, that would have led to a ground incursion any minute because there was no movement on it. There was even concern, I think, within Israel, including among, commentators, that the Israeli government and its negotiating team may not have really prioritized keeping the hostages alive on the assumption that they may not be able to keep them alive and that it wouldn't hold off on the ground operation. That has since changed, right? So the ground operation is held off. We've seen the release of 4 hostages. At this point, I would say there is a scenario in which Israel continues to wait, at least on the ground operation, but it's very much speculation right now. In terms of, listen, we are bracing for a longer war. If there's one thing that the Israeli government has been very unified about in its messaging, is that this war is not going to end soon. The danger of opening up another front in the north with Hezbollah is very real. Every day, this seemingly contained tit-for-tat firing seems to get somewhat worse. Tens of thousands of people have evacuated already from the north on the Israeli side, never mind, of course, the entire southern region, certainly near the Gaza area, has been evacuated. So I do expect, in a way, this delay might even bode, the fact that the delay in starting is like preparing people psychologically for a longer operation to begin with. It's hard to know right now. In terms of what I think will happen the day after, right now, what you hear among more establishment figures, either from the Israeli government or the army or is contradictory things. The only scenarios people can imagine in Israel at the upper levels, or at least in their public conversations, are somehow that Israel reoccupies Gaza or that it gets turned over to Palestinian Authority control. And then on the other hand, the defense minister has announced that the aims of that one of the central aims of this war is going to be to completely cut off Gaza, that Israel will have no more responsibility for Gaza at all, which, by the way, I think is frankly a meaningless statement. Because you can't take a scissors and cut off geography, right? And, just the physical embedded nature of Gaza means that you can't actually separate the fate of Gaza from Israel for reasons that I could get into, but they may be a little bit hard to hear. For example, if there is no fuel in Gaza, Gaza cannot use its sewage treatment plants. And when it can't treat its sewage, it pollutes Israeli waters. So I told you that would be hard to hear. These things are not separate. They can't actually be separated. And so I think that the 2 options that have been discussed are both also essentially non-starters. Israel doesn't want to occupy Gaza permanently, except if you talk about really, really the most theocratic and extremist members of the Israeli government who do have one incentive for reoccupying Gaza, and that's because they want to rebuild settlements that were evacuated, dismantled in 2005. But that seems fantastical. Nevertheless, we should never totally discount what sounds fantastical in the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because these things can happen. And the other option, I think that you were asking prescriptively, I wouldn't go so far as to say prescriptive, but the only other alternative that people are starting to think about, including myself, but independently, in other words, I think people are coming at this from different angles, is that there are international actors involved. Let's put that in the broadest sense. These could be Arab countries who get involved with peacekeeping forces, which by all accounts, they don't want to do. And I can understand why. This can be Western countries trying to get involved and help, support, peacekeeping forces, or help provide the basis for building institutions, which I think of as something like what happened in Kosovo, right? Which also sounds pretty fantastical. Or there can be some combination, of Western countries and Middle Eastern countries, or countries in the region that are very influential, like Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia for that matter, taking some role, but these are extremely broad-ranging and vague at this point. Nevertheless, it's sort of an inchoate third way beyond the two other options, which to my mind, neither of them are even remotely viable: Israeli reoccupation or Palestinian Authority control.
Yeah, so we would sort of get at too, again, it's not just Hamas, but the Gazan people. People are interested, by the way, there's a very interesting online website called Whispered in Gaza that you can go to. You get a sense for not Hamas, but the Gazan people, and things like a poll done in July showed 50% of the Gazan people wanted Hamas to do less about, fighting Israel and more about their own lives. And so some of these questions are about, the Gazan people itself, which is so important to this. But I could go on, I'm not going to, but so we're going to start the questions now. Let me tell you how we're going to proceed. Our two co-sponsors are the Center for Jewish Studies and AGS has a student council sitting up here. And I'll take a couple of questions from the students who help run AGS. And I want to take this opportunity to thank Serena Bazemore from the Center for Jewish Studies and the whole AGS team, Susie, KBE, and my colleague Tristan Fever for organizing this and everything else. So there are, I'm told, we are mic'd from the ceiling, but I need you to speak up because we're also, as you can see online, and a lot of people live streaming in. I'll repeat questions as needed. And also please keep them as questions, not speeches. And we'll try to get to as many people as we can in that respect. So I'm looking at the council here. Anybody have a question to start? Go ahead.
Can you speak a little bit on Israel? I think about it as 14% larger than the size of New Jersey. It's a pretty tiny plot of land, but it garnered such international attention. I'm so interested because you've studied other global conflicts. Why is it that you see this region get so much attention? And do you think it's warranted to get this much attention over the other four conflicts?
I probably should repeat it. I don't know what you think. So talk about the smallness of Israel itself, but so much attention to this region, not just now, but for a long time. Why so much attention to the Middle East? Is it warranted, right? Is that fair sense of your question?
Yeah, and then you keep adding some of the other places you've worked in.
Yeah, in comparison to other places.
I've worked not only on conflict zones, I've done public opinion research and political analysis in about 15 other countries, and in addition to the ones where I have a special focus on the conflict area. I do think this place gets absolutely disproportionate attention, but my response would be not that it should get less attention, but that the other places should get more. That's what I would like to see. Not that I want people to only think about conflicts, people should think about good things too, but the fact is there are, human rights violations and violations of the laws of war and occupations and, things that are threatening to the international system, or that the international system was designed to help mitigate and contain, that are happening in other parts of the world, and they just don't get that level of attention. I think they should. So I wouldn't say we need less. I would say the other places need more. That's one thing. Why do I think that is the case? It's complicated, but I do think that in some ways, Israel is like the original problem of the international system. Israel came into being alongside the international system. This international system that we talked about had deep roots in the late 19th and early 20th century. Many of the kinds of conventions and treaties and the charter that was built after 1945 had their roots in earlier conventions and charters. So it was a long time coming, but it kind of sprung into being in a way. after World War II, at the very same time when the Palestine problem was turned over to the UN, for a decision. And, some of the international norms were changing at that time. I mean, I'm just debating how much to get into, like, specific examples of these most toxic issues. But I think the fact is that the international community felt particularly responsible for this conflict, and it has been one of the first and most enduring unresolved conflicts that predated the establishment of the international system in a way, in terms of the roots of the problem, and has continued throughout all the other. And then this international system we talk about, some of the conventions, some of the rules, for example, the international law with relation to refugees, much of it evolved after the refugee problem was created in 1947, 48, and 49. And so future conflicts could rest on the basis that was evolving over time. Now, the solutions have never been great. I mean, I wouldn't say that there's some great way to resolve conflict, but I think that the fact that the world has been dealing with this for so long, and the international community created Israel, I wouldn't say created the problem. The problem is, emerges from deep historic forces. But the great powers were largely responsible. The British feel responsible. The Americans quickly took a side. It involves all of these great powers. I also have a pet theory that because Israel and Palestine, contain the seat of Judeo-Christianity, this is the physical location, that a huge swath of the global population, Christians, Muslims, Jews, all have a stake in this place. It's just not the same with Nagorno-Karabakh, which is an incredibly, a historic site for Christianity, but it's not considered the birthplace. Of course, Armenians are proud of the fact that they are among the first to adopt Christianity, but it's not quite the same as, I think, so many of the world's population feeling that this is a holy place for them. So all of those forces converge. And then, of course, it's a touchstone for everything that goes on in the Middle East. So it, has held a very central position in geopolitics during the Cold War, and of course in the post-Cold War era. And so I think all of those forces converge, sort of the softer forces of people's spiritual and emotional attachment to the enduring symbolism of Israel-Palestine as a problem of the international system, and the immediate geopolitics, both during the Cold War and now, that lead to that additional focus. And then it's become kind of, the focal point for many activists around the world. I mean, I'm not saying that in a cynical way. When I was in high school, growing up in the US, pretty far from South Africa, okay, fighting apartheid was our cause. Everybody I knew, including myself, was fighting apartheid. Did I really understand it? Did I really know it in depth? No. Do I think there were two sides of the matter? No. I mean, I think I was on the right side in opposing apartheid. But it would be overstating the case to say that I really knew what I was talking about. It was our cause at that time.
Yeah, I would just add one thing to that, which is that three-letter word called oil, which isn't in that patch of land. But if you use the 1973 Yom Kippur Arab-Israeli War as an example, that was the first major OPEC oil embargo. And again, showing off my age, I had a cool '67 Mustang convertible then. They got 8 miles to the gallon, but gas was like 26 cents a gallon, right? Which was our divine right. It was the 11th, thing in the Bill of Rights, right? And so ever since then, that's been there as well, and it's related to these, as well. So, yeah, let me take one more question here, and then I may start to go around. Go ahead, yeah.
You asked the question regarding the international order and the role of international organizations. You mentioned you believe that post-war military order that was put in place, but recently there's been talking about the breakdown of that system. And when you look at organizations such as the UN, the way in which their voices have been as heard in this conflict, in this crisis, how do you see resolution coming from this new fragmented international order?
Yeah, I'm going to try to summarize the question as I understood it, but you'll correct me if I'm wrong. Having professed my, faith in the international system, I maybe would correct the idea of faith. But do I think, despite having seen the breakdown of that system or the failures of that system in recent years, do I think that there can be any hope that that system will come through and try to advance conflict resolution here? Is that the question? Yeah. Listen, I don't want to overstate the case. There have been contradictions and outright hypocrisies of how this international order was applied from the beginning. It's not new. We have to face it. And there have been mistakes, and so I'm not so much saying I have a belief or a faith in the system. I'm saying it is the best system we have, and it is incumbent upon us to try to make it work, even knowing, and I think this is a and constantly finding new flaws and hypocrisies and contradictions of that system. I don't see anything better that I think can improve, the mitigation of conflict and violence. So that's the extent to which I believe in it. Do I think that is, what is that system? Another part of the problem is that when we talk about the international system, really we're usually talking about the Western powers. And we have to be honest about that as well. So when we ask who will come forth and help, advance a resolution to this conflict if we think it needs it. I mean, I will openly say I am of the side that believes that we do need a political resolution to this conflict for the reasons I mentioned. But there are an awful lot of people, there are more people in Israel right now who do not believe that there can be a political resolution to the conflict, and frankly among Palestinians too. And I say everything I'd say that characterizes Israeli or Palestinian society is based on polling. The people and their governments, when they say openly, do not believe there is such a thing as a political resolution that can contain the existing conflict. And I say contain. I don't think any resolution can actually solve conflict entirely. You show me a human society that does not have crime or violence or conflict. It doesn't exist. We have to stop, letting the perfect be the enemy of doing better, because it becomes an excuse. So if we are, I at least in this room, at least I can speak for myself, prefer to find a political resolution that can at least try to contain and mitigate this conflict. I think it will, at this point, come only from the powers that have leverage over Israel, which has much stronger political power in the world. And the only power that has that kind of strength over Israel is the United States. Without the United States to really take the lead on that, I don't see the other Western powers taking a powerful enough stance. They can take a strong moral stance. They can express their views. They can try to persuade Israel. They have a little bit of leverage, but I think that they won't actually use it significantly unless America is behind it. That's the best I can say.
All right, let me expand a little bit. Okay, I'll come over to the lady here, and then I'll come to this side of the room after that and try to get as many people as I can.
Hey, so I was really happy for one that you brought up Armenia and Azerbaijan, because I think that has been really widely ignored in Western media. And I was wondering if you think that America has an obligation to speak up or even go as far as to intervene in the conflict, since it has taken very strong stances in a lot of other territorial disputes between two non-American countries in recent history.
Yeah, I think I would like to see America play a stronger role, especially because America, and the Biden administration, before the elections, during the campaign, the Biden administration took a somewhat stronger moral position on this. And I think that I would like to see them take some sort of leadership on what happens now. Having said that, I don't think it's exactly clear what the two sides really want to happen now. The Armenian side, I can tell you from having spent my time there, I haven't spoken as much to the Azerbaijani side, but what they really want right now, it seems to me, coming from, the people that I spoke with, is the opportunity for security guarantees if their people want to go back. But frankly, their people aren't going to want to go back. I mean, that's how I read it. In other words, what does security guarantees mean? It means reasserting some form of control. And the Azerbaijanis are not going to let that happen. And so it's not, plus there was already a peace process sort of in place between the Republic of Armenia and Azerbaijan before this happened. And so I think Armenia has an interest in continuing to reach some sort of an agreement with Azerbaijan. And if they're to do that, they don't really want to endanger it. And so I think they're going to, in other words, what I'm saying is we're not quite at the place where the Israelis and Palestinians are of having a completely zero-sum dispute over whether there is self-determination at all for one side of the conflict. Armenia this is one of the slight difference, a big difference. There is a Republic of Armenia. I don't approve of resolving conflicts by force, but it's not the same as a society that has been denied the right of self-determination since, forever, basically. And so I think the means of resolving that conflict will deal with the situation in Karabakh probably as part of the negotiations between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And I think America should take a leading role on that, but also try, there's a serious demand and expectation in Armenia that the Azerbaijanis will be held accountable for having committed this act of what really can only be described as ethnic cleansing. And that has to be part of it as well. So, in some ways, the political question is probably not quite as complicated as Israel-Palestine now. But will there be accountability, for having committed an egregious violation of human rights, America should provide at least a leading voice on that and hopefully provide a leading role. I mean, it sent Samantha Power there to show that America is prepared to give aid to the refugees, which was fine, but honestly in the region was greeted quite cynically. It's like after the fact, you know. And the UN hadn't had any serious visit to Nagorno-Karabakh in 30 years, and then after the expulsion they came in. So it's not just America, right? The entire international system needs to decide if it's going to actually hold those responsible accountable.
All right. I'm going to take, I'll take two questions on this side, and then we'll do the same on that side. You first, and then you second, okay?
Thank you. I wanted to ask about your study of Israeli democracy and your perspective on if this war changes your outlook for Israeli democracy. So I guess to ask kind of pointed questions. In your view, the day before this war began, what was the status of Israel's democracy? Was it a democracy? Where was it headed? And do the events of the last couple of weeks change that, or is this kind of a blip and the future of Israeli democracy is the same the day after the war as the day before the war?
Let's get this other question.
Okay.
All right, yeah.
So I wanted to go back to your point in regards of information and how it's difficult to really verify what's going on. And I've heard some individuals call this also a war of information as a result. So I was wondering how you recommend general individuals not affected directly by the conflict, how they should approach the issue and forming opinions. Those individuals as well as those who are affected by the conflict, whether that be in Israel or just in your familial connection.
Okay, so the first question was essentially, what was the state of Israeli democracy before October 7th? Was it a democracy, and how will this war affect it? And the second question was, how can people who are not directly involved in this conflict understand and distinguish good information or real information from mis or disinformation, and people in the region who are directly affected? Both very good questions. Actually, let me start with yours because it's a little bit shorter for me to answer it. For one thing, if information is real, if a fact is a fact, it's universal. It should be something empirical that anybody can see, whether you are directly affected by the conflict or whether you're, sitting in a completely different country. And so I wouldn't say there's a different approach to understanding information depending on where you are, except that if you're in the region, then you can find out firsthand. That's the only real difference. In terms of understanding sources, I mean, without getting too distracted, I have to make a little plug for mainstream media here. You have to be really suspicious of things that come from social media because you can't always identify their source. When I see a video on any social media, no matter how convincing it is, no matter how real it is, even if I know, even if I can identify the location because I'm familiar with it myself, I will not use it and I will not refer to it and I will not promote it or retweet it or anything unless I see the source. Who did it? Was there a name? Is there a media organization yet? Anybody? If there's nothing, I won't use it. And it's hard because it can be very compelling evidence sometimes. But that's just, I mean, anything that if you can't see the source yourself, okay, ideally should be the first-hand source. But if you can't be there yourself, always look for the original source. And if it's not an original source that you know you can trust, I would dismiss it entirely. When it's an original source you know you can trust, I would still try to get to the bottom of it. Even if you're reading it in whatever your favorite newspaper is that you think is really credible, make sure that the piece of evidence that you're looking at, that the reporter has cited the source. Okay. Some sources are biased or might have a bias. Look at that. And then I would say the other thing that I'm personally, very cautious about is, all the criticism of mainstream media and the fact that politicians, sorry to say this, but they do lie. Okay, they do. They really do. And the army lies. Every army lies. I mean, politicians, army, intelligence, they all lie. Now, do they lie systematically? Probably not. Do they lie with a purpose? Yes. But I think if you start to doubt information because you can't find the source, that's good. But if you start to doubt information in ways that, in order to justify what you think to be the truth, you have to presume a conspiracy, I would question yourself. Okay. Crossing that line can be worrisome. I mean, it can be also a little bit vague. That's what happened during Corona, I think. And you're only a conspiracy theorist if there's not a conspiracy. See what I mean? So it does get tricky, but just look for the source always. And if it's not a source that you know, that you can identify, that you're familiar with, and take into account the source's bias, but doesn't necessarily delegitimize the information. In terms of the question of whether Israel's democracy, thank you for the question. Read my book. It's right here. At an 80% discount for the ebook and 50% discount for the print book, with our coupons. But but I mean, that was the question that I started with, because, and I will tell you a little anecdote about the nice title here, which is The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel. People said it's way too long, and they're right. The original title was shorter. It was supposed to be The Crooked Timber of Israeli Democracy. Except that while I was writing it, and of course I started writing it with a lot of the ideas and the research already in place, but I had to really, dig deeper and think more. And I realized that I wasn't comfortable with the title, Israeli Democracy, because I don't really think there is Israeli democracy. There is a lot of democracy in Israel. There are democratic institutions. There's democratic practice. We have mostly free and fair elections for the people who are allowed to vote, which is not everybody. I don't believe in democracy for some. And as a political scientist, I ask who governs, who's in control, who has the power. So if you're starting with that, you have to look at the people who are affected by people who are under Israel's power, includes everybody between the river and the sea, because Israel has the ultimate authority over so much of life. And therefore, I have to look at it as the Israeli regime governing everybody. So it's not actually a democracy, because half the people there can't, or whatever percentage can't vote. Not exactly half, but about half of the people between the river and the sea are Jewish or Palestinian. But the Palestinians are, let's say, 5.5 million right now, and Israeli voting population is over 6 million, 6.5 million, let's say. So I couldn't say Israeli democracy, but you also can't discount the fact that there is a lot of democracy in Israel. And that is what the citizens were trying to save, and rightly so. And so the situation before October 6th was, I see it as an arc. To the extent that there is democracy in Israel, it was at its lowest point in the earliest years. Okay, under what Israelis consider to be a left-wing leadership. The Mapai government, led by David Ben-Gurion, the founder of the country, it was a very undemocratic time. You essentially had something like one-party rule, not by design, but that's how it worked out for the first almost 30 years. You didn't have a constitution, and you didn't have basic laws guaranteeing any human rights. The Palestinian citizens of Israel were not citizens until 1952, because Israel didn't pass a citizenship law. Nobody were technically, there were no citizens. But there was a law of return allowing any Jew to come to Israel from 1950. So the Arabo-Palestinian citizens of Israel didn't actually have citizenship. And even when they passed that law, it only applied, because it was tailored very carefully, to exclude many of them. There had to be court battles over the years to win amendments, to petition, the government and challenge them, and then win and get amendments to that law for the majority, for most of the Arab or Palestinian citizens of Israel to finally get citizenship. So in these situations, you had a very undemocratic situation in the beginning. Never mind that Mapai also basically controlled most state institutions and led to great dependency on the party machine, which meant that people's vote wasn't even entirely free and fair. And that's one of the reasons they were able to get reelected all those years. From that time, of course, and the fact that, sorry if I didn't mention this before, and the fact that immediately those Palestinian or Arab citizens of Israel were placed under martial law, a military regime that lasted formally until December 1966, but the colonial legislation that was used to govern them, the defense emergency regulations that were carried directly over from British colonial rule, were still in place until middle of 1968, by which time the occupation had already started. So the trajectory was upwards. Israel became more democratic after, let's say, after the end of the military government, after the first peaceful transfer of power to a new government in 1977, which the old elites said was the most undemocratic thing because it was Likud and they were considered fascist or neo-fascist, but actually they were a party that was both very nationalist, territorial expansionist, wanted to build settlements and keep control over the West Bank at least, as well as Jerusalem naturally, but also considered themselves committed to liberal democracy and the constitutional order, and in many ways changed elements of the Israeli system to become more democratic over time, leading to a major economic crisis in the 1980s, which pushed Israel to become more liberal economically, and then Israel became more committed to global integration and global economic integration. And the idea developed that in order to become more liberal and democratic, you had to be globally integrated, and to do that, you had to eventually have peace with the Palestinians. And so I think it was not by accident the 1990s saw Israel's most liberalizing era and the beginning of something like a peace process, which was not actually a peace process, but it was the beginning of something that was supposed to be a genuine peace process. That concept broke down. It broke down over time, but largely during the Second Intifada, the failed peace process, etc., which paved the way for the resurgence of a kind of nationalism alongside the growth of global populism, which helped bolster Netanyahu's rise. And then Israel, from this arc of reaching a sort of peak of striving towards liberal and even in some ways progressive values, at least for Israeli citizens, and the beginning of a process that might have one day ended the occupation, begins to decline. So illiberalism becomes more fashionable, the peace process collapses, the occupation deepens, Israel becomes more committed to expanding its grip over the West Bank and essentially annexing de facto. And in order to do that, you have to maintain a very nationalist environment that does not easily tolerate dissent. And so you see illiberal policies coming from the government. You see a much more nationalist social discourse. You see branding of others, whether they are political others like the left wing or the Arab Palestinian minority in Israel, as traitors. And that is backed by legislation. And you have a slew of legislation that essentially attacks liberal and democratic values and civil society in the 2010s, whatever we call that decade. And then from I would say around 2012, 13, you see the beginning of the attack on the judiciary. Because in order to back the legislation that undercuts liberal or democratic values, the first thing you need to do is incapacitate the only institution capable of pushing back on the power of the government. And that comes to a head with Netanyahu joining the effort personally because he's under investigation. So all these forces converge, but they have very, very deep roots in Israeli history. And that's what I tried to get at with the book, which, by the way, I began writing the book long before the establishment of this government. I had finished the first full draft of the book when this government was sworn in. So these problems did not start with, and I think it's also a mistake to blame it all on Netanyahu. You're giving yourselves an easy pass if you think Netanyahu single-handedly did all this.
So I promised two more questions, and I said we're going to run a little bit short on time. Did you still have one, Jay? Okay, one there and over here, and then we'll have to wrap. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. So as we know, Israel is in the process of brokering an agreement with many of the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, and that was taken as an affront from the perspective of Iran, particularly Hamas. Do you think there's any sort of process of economic encroachment now between Israel and the Gulf states for any normalization of relations in the future?
Yeah, they're a related question. To what extent do you think that Hamas attack the Saudi-Israeli normalization?
Yeah. Okay, so I think that for one thing, Israel already has relations with the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. So those deals are basically done, although the deal with Sudan is still kind of up there, especially because Sudan is now involved in this, and also a very egregious civil war, which, how much attention does that get, apropos? Not getting enough attention. Really, it's very sad because they were undergoing kind of a democratic transition at the time of the military coup that led to the breakdown of the governing forces. So never mind. Those agreements do exist with the most important of those states, really, which is the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco, let's say 3 of the states. So those agreements are in place, and so far they have held. It's interesting, actually, we haven't heard that much from the Emiratis. Qatar is playing a much more significant role right now. In terms of Saudi Arabia, I think that it will be on hold, but never underestimate the staying power of economic relations. Those economic relations, certainly with the Gulf states, existed long before the Abraham Accords, and they will continue because they are based on very significant transactional needs. And I think they will go on. Maybe we won't see as much tourism if there's not, great feeling among the public. And with Saudi Arabia, I think that there is still a potential. I think we have seen a sort of cautious approach from the Saudis. They're kind of trying to show solidarity with the Palestinians, but I read it as a little bit of making sure that the message gets across rather than genuine sentiment. Remember also that the relationship between the Emiratis and the Palestinians is terrible, okay, really bad. So I guess maybe that's one reason why we're not seeing, huge, role for them just yet. We'll see what happens. And in terms of the Saudis, I think that, again, their interests in promoting that deal are still there. They would like to have approval for this civilian nuclear program. They would like to have an arrangement with, with the Americans for security guarantees. And I think they would personally like to have more open relations with Israel, largely so they can buy a lot of Israeli technology, including military exports and cyber technology. So those interests are still there. And I think that they will manage to endure even war. But in the meantime, we have to first make sure that there's not, an escalation on the regional front. Because if that happens, all bets are off, really. And to what extent was that an impetus for Hamas's attack? I mean, I think it was there, but I don't really see that. I don't want to underestimate Hamas's capacity, because as we know, they have tremendous capacity. Really, they've managed to outsmart all the Israeli security and intelligence agencies. But I think that Hamas's interests are much more about the Palestinian problem rather than the geopolitics of it. So in the sense that the Palestinians were being left out, and that had been happening since the Abraham Accords were first signed in 2020, and the sense that it had dropped off the global agenda, and that the Biden administration was giving Israel a free pass, and that they weren't able to have political channels to make their claim as the leaders of the Palestinians, and that they were living under the blockade for all those years and channeling public rage in Gaza. And I would just make one point, I meant to mention this before. I would refer to the people in Gaza as Palestinians rather than Gaza. Just because I don't think we should accept what Israel has tried to put into place all these years, which is an effective separation plan, which has been stated quite openly and certainly in policy. And so I think that, of course, they are, they can refer to themselves as Gazans. It's not a slur. But I just want us to be conscious that the Palestinians don't see themselves as Gazans or West Bankers, other than in the very sense that we might say I'm a New Yorker or something else. Just as people consider themselves Americans, Palestinians are still Palestinians, and I think we shouldn't reinforce that divide. But let's say that it was a factor. But I wouldn't even go so far as to presume that it was particularly about the Saudi deal, such as it was, but more about the general sense that they had been abandoned by the Arab countries once and for all. And by the way, the Palestinian sense of abandonment by the Arab countries well predates the Abraham Accords.
So I want to close with three sets of thanks. One is to everybody that helped make this possible, our AGS team. Okay, and Dahlia has her thanks as well, the Center for Jewish Studies, and also the support we've been getting from the university, folks from various aspects of Duke University. Second, to all of you who committed your time to be here today, and I think we found it very valued education. I know time is really valuable for all of us, students included, and I think that's the kind of commitment we really like to foster at Duke, because we're all busy, but one of the nice things about being in a university like this is opportunities like this. And third, and most of all, is to Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin. I mean, this has been a fabulous session, covered a lot, and you've done so thoughtfully and with depth. And I think both answered a lot of questions and planted a lot of seeds for people to think at. So please join me in thanking Dr. Dahlia. There are flyers for the book outside.